Advice to authors that want to make the opening of their book more interesting: starting with a man having a heart attack is a pretty effective way to go. Oh, and kill off 99% of the world's population. Station 11 is a post-apocalyptic story about a future where 99% of the world's population dies to a mysterious and vicious virus called the Georgia flu. Anyone who comes into contact with it is guaranteed to die within 48 hours. And you might be thinking, why, Alex, that sounds remarkably like The Stand by Stephen King. You will hear me reference The Stand several times while talking about this story, because what was the likelihood that I ended up reading 2 stories about a virus that killed off 99% of the world's population during COVID? I didn't plan it that way. It just happened. And I would have to agree that they are similar in premise, but a little bit different in execution. The Stand had supernatural elements that grounded the story in fantasy rather than in reality. The characters that survived did so because they miraculously had a mutation that prevented them from getting ill. Station 11 is arguably more terrifying because there is no such mutation. There is no immunity. Anyone who comes into contact with the virus is guaranteed to die, so those that end up surviving did so out of pure luck. There wasn't any reason that they should have survived. They just did. I think what I found most surprising was my own emotional response while reading this story. I can honestly tell you that I didn't expect to take it to heart the way that I did, because I certainly didn't take The Stand very seriously, but there was something that was a little different about this story, and I think it was because it hit too close to home. Some of the elements that are in this book are things that actually happened when COVID first broke out. So many people were talking about it like it was going to kill off a huge percent of the world's population. It was effectively going to be a plague to end all plagues. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen, but many people can still say that they've lost loved ones to the virus and still are right now. So you might be thinking, 99% of the world's population didn't die, Alex, so why are you comparing the pandemic of Station 11 to that of COVID-19? And you're right, but hear me out. Society didn't collapse, but it was irreversibly changed. Consider the fact that we now have different work from home policies and quarantine rules, not to mention the psychological damage that many people face from being isolated from other people for so long. How many people do you know that are afraid to go out into crowds now? How many children have you met that lack social skills because they weren't able to socialize while in school? Probably a lot. And there were long-lasting implications for our society, even if it's still running. Now, I'm not saying that what we have experienced is anything close to the drama of Station 11, but it did make me pause. For comparison, I also read The Stand after COVID, as I mentioned, but its inclusion of a supernatural evil made it feel less real. Station 11 had no such element, and in a way seemed to represent a timeline in which COVID was more deadly than it is. One of the characters, August, is a huge fan of physics and the idea of the multiverse, which, funny enough, was something that Stephen Hawking wrote about before he passed. The idea that the multiverse likely does actually exist. So I found it really fascinating that Mandel included it in this novel. And I want to share this quote with you. August said that given an infinite number of parallel universes, there had to be one where there had been no pandemic and he'd grown up to be a physicist as planned, or one where there had been a pandemic but the virus had had a subtly different genetic structure, some minuscule variants that rendered it survivable. In any case, a universe in which civilization hadn't been so brutally interrupted. And in a way, I can't help but wonder, maybe there was a reality out there where I died from COVID. Maybe there's a reality out there where COVID never happened. It's those kinds of questions that make me love science fiction, which this book is not science fiction. It's definitely dystopian fiction. But I really liked that element being included and the idea that they were questioning whether the reality could have been different. I should note that this story was published in 2014, which was 5 years before COVID would even break out. And I can't help but wonder if Mandel was spooked by her own sort of premonition when news started coming out in 2020 of society shutting down in the way that it does in the story. All of the cases of the hospitals rapidly filling up, the overcrowding, the deaths of doctors who were exposed to the first patients. We've admitted over 200 flu patients since this morning, Hua said. 160 in the past 3 hours. 15 of them have died. The ER's full of new cases. We've got beds parked in the hallways. It's eerie how similar it was. The fall of civilization was probably the most fascinating part for me, and the ways that the uninfected would try to rebuild society and form communities was surprisingly hopeful. That forming of community through adversity was my favorite part of The Stand. and I think Mandel handled it in a pretty sensitive and heartfelt way. In the story, there's the implication that the fall of society was so devastating that even years later, people were in shock. Some of them were waiting for reality to return to normal much longer than any sane person would. One of the things I really wish had been discussed, and I'm honestly surprised Mandel didn't mention, was the lack of birth control. There was talk of other medications like the need for insulin or tetanus shots, and how there were people who died without those, but nobody seemed to be concerned about the idea of having too many kids in a world where there just wasn't enough resources. There were some characters in the story that had been married for quite a few years who only had 1 to 2 children, which statistically seems very unlikely, given that condoms expire and people didn't have access to medical herbs the way that the ancient Egyptians did. There was also no talk of C-sections, breached births, or the need for blood transfusions. So I guess the implication is that you either had an easy birth or you died, and that the pull-out method somehow got more effective. Seems unlikely, but okay. The COVID-related stuff isn't all I want to talk about, though. There was so much to this plot, much more than just the fall of civilization. Especially because so much of the story actually takes place before the collapse. My biggest complaint with the early chapters was how I felt that I needed to make a character list of all of the different names. We are introduced to the Traveling Symphony, where some of the characters have names, but a huge percentage of them are only referred to by the position that they play in the symphony, like the 6th guitar or the clarinet. It was honestly absurd how few characters had names in the very beginning, and it was incredibly confusing. It took me way too long to realize that any character that didn't have a name just wasn't important. To give credit to Mandel, the idea that the collapse of society would render having even a name meaningless is pretty striking commentary on societal norms. So many people put an emphasis on their name being their identity, so imagine living in a world where it's inconsequential to have one. The real reason I bring this up, though, is because the book blurb frames the Traveling Symphony as being the main host of characters, with Kirsten at its center. But the truth is, the Traveling Symphony, they're only a very small part of the story. Kirsten isn't even really the main character. She's more of a framing device that ties the other main characters together. Characters like Miranda and Jeevan and Clark. They're introduced in the pre-collapse segments and are not related to the symphony in any way. The way that the narrative is structured is that it flips back and forth between the now cult reality of 20 years post-collapse and the years before the collapse, in the final days of the human race hanging on to the last shreds of society. And I can tell you that as soon as we flip back for the first time, that was when the story to me became way more coherent. And I'm not sure if it's just because all of the characters had real names, but it certainly helped. Kirsten has an obsession with an actor named Arthur Linder, who died on stage when she was 8 years old in a play that they were performing in together. We learn about how he became famous and how those around him viewed his choices. Those flashbacks to the time before the collapse or right after were far more interesting to me than the 20 years post-collapse. I realized halfway through the book that the reason perhaps that the past and the present perspectives were so jarring to me was because usually in a tale like this, Kirsten would be framed as the main character, where we're seeing her in the years before and after the collapse, a then and now, if you will. But the stories of the past not only aren't from Kirsten's perspective, but they're about things that she never could have known about. The only things that she really knows about Arthur's life are the things that she's gleaned from old magazines and from a novel that her mom had. So she understands at least superficially how those events unfolded, but she doesn't know the real story. And in a way, the fact that we get to learn the real story versus just that perspective was really refreshing and something that I greatly enjoyed about this book. I'm also really glad that we weren't stuck with Kirsten as the only main character, because to be honest with you, I couldn't really connect with her all that well, even though I felt bad for her and her situation. We spend so much more time in the past rather than in the world that Kirsten lives in now, that it kind of takes away from the danger that Kirsten and the Traveling Symphony are facing from the Prophet, who, by the way, is a cult leader who's following them around. You might be like, Alex, why didn't you mention that before? Well, because it's really not the biggest part of the story, even though the book blurb frames it that way. That's the problem. In the beginning, it seems like their struggle is going to be with this band of cultists. It felt kind of anticlimactic. This is one of those stories where I felt like the blurb on the back of the book did not do the book justice. It was close, but it wasn't quite right, and I feel like that's because it was framed more as a post-apocalyptic thriller than what it actually was, which was just dystopian fiction. And there's nothing wrong with that. I like what the book actually was, but I think that this is a classic example of the marketing department trying to frame the story around something that they thought would be more engaging, like a cult, rather than what the story was actually, which was this heartfelt tale of the way that people cope with horrible tragedy and how they continue on in their lives even after something as horrible as all of society collapsing. They didn't believe in that premise to pitch it that way. They wanted to hook people with this idea of a cult, and I find that misleading. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention where the namesake of Station 11 comes from. Station 11 is revealed to be a comic book that Kirsten has in her possession. Though despite the novel's namesake, we really don't learn much about the story of the comic, we more glean facts about it, but we do get an understanding of where the comic book came from. Station 11 is the creation of Miranda, Arthur's first ex-wife, and it's her own personal project that she's been working on for many years, and she doesn't really ever care if it gets published. She's doing it just for herself. There are only 10 copies of Station 11 in the whole world, and Kirsten has one of them because Arthur gave it to her. Miranda cared a lot about the images more so than the speech bubbles that were in the comic. Through those images, we're able to see her profound loneliness, but also her sense of escapism, something that she gives her readers whenever they look at her work. Miranda you can see as being someone who lives more in her make-believe world than she does in reality, and in a way that's kind of similar to actors. It's noted several times in the story that Arthur always seems like he's acting. That makes a lot of sense, because actors spend so much time playing other people that they rarely get moments to play themselves. Readers become disenchanted with Arthur in a way that Kirsten never will, because she collects fragments of the person that she believed him to be rather than the man he actually was. Kirsten herself lives for the traveling symphony and lives to be an actor. It's all she wants to do. It's all she's ever wanted to do. One of the aspects I enjoy most about this novel is how the characters are connected in unexpected ways. Jeevan, for example, is a man who sits in the audience the night that Arthur is giving his last performance. And as he sees that Arthur is going down when he's having a heart attack, he runs up on stage to perform life-saving CPR. He's not able to save Arthur, but he does connect with Kirsten when she's a little girl at the age of 8, and we're able to see how their lives diverge after the virus starts spreading in Toronto. Ironically, Jeevan also was a member of the paparazzi before he started studying to be a paramedic. He used to follow Arthur and Miranda around when they were still married. And then there's Clark, who's Arthur's best friend. He's present the night of an ill-fated dinner party right before Miranda and Arthur get divorced. Clark ultimately ends up meeting Kirsten years after the collapse, and they bond over their memory of Arthur. It was truly a great way to frame a story, and it made it more meaningful than the idea that we were just following around random people. It really makes you feel like the world is a small place. But those are the things I wanted to talk about with regards to Station 11. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you're interested in picking up Station 11, or if you've read about it already, please do tell me about it in the comments. I ended up giving this story 4 stars overall, which is a very solid rating for me. And if you ended up really liking this video, I would appreciate it a whole lot if you would give it a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe to me. I'm still a really new channel. You don't have to, but I would appreciate it. I really hope that maybe you'll come hang out with me on my next video, and for those of you who are already subscribed, I really appreciate you. Hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.